The room didn't react immediately when he said it. It paused. Not because the words were loud, they weren't, but because they were precise, public, final. Take off the hat, or leave. A simple line, the kind that sounds small, until you realize it's not about the hat, it's about control. Around the table, people shifted just slightly. Eyes moved, but not directly. No one wants to be the first to look when a line is drawn that clearly, because moments like this aren't about the object. They're about what everyone silently agrees to accept. She didn't argue, didn't explain, didn't negotiate, just stood there for half a second longer than expected, like she was measuring something no one else could see yet. Then she turned and walked out. No resistance, no emotion, no scene, which is exactly why it felt wrong. Because when someone leaves that calmly, in a room like this, it usually means one thing. They're not the one losing control. And 5 minutes later, everyone in that room would understand exactly why. The door didn't slam. It closed softly, controlled, almost polite. And somehow, that made it worse. Because in rooms like this, noise is expected. Conflict, raised voices, tension. You can process that. You can respond to it. Silence? Silence lingers. It doesn't resolve. It waits. The CEO didn't turn immediately after she left. That was deliberate. He kept his posture steady, eyes still directed toward the screen at the far end of the room, as if nothing essential had changed. Because from his perspective, nothing had. A policy was enforced. A boundary was clarified. Authority remained intact. That's how these moments are usually recorded. Clean, contained, finished. But something in the room didn't follow that script. A slight shift. Someone adjusted their chair, but too late, like they missed the timing. Another reached for their glass of water and didn't drink. Micro delays. Tiny desynchronizations. The kind that don't look like reactions, but are. Because everyone had just witnessed something that looked small and felt disproportionate. The CEO finally turned, slowly, reclaiming the center of the room. Let's continue. 2 words, simple, efficient, the kind that usually resets momentum instantly. And for a second, it worked. Laptops reopened, screens lit up. Someone nodded, already scrolling back to the agenda. Execution resumed. But not alignment, because alignment requires something deeper than motion. It requires certainty, and certainty had just cracked. Across the table, one of the directors leaned slightly toward another. Not to speak, just enough to share a glance. That glance said everything words couldn't. Was that necessary? No one asked it out loud, because questioning in real time carries risk. And risk, in environments like this, is managed through silence. But silence, today, wasn't stabilizing anything. It was accumulating. The CEO moved on, already referencing the next slide. Projected growth remains within range. The investor call is scheduled. He stopped. Not fully, just a fraction. A break in rhythm so small most wouldn't notice. But enough. Because one word had just entered the room again. Investor. And this time, it didn't land the same way. Because now it carried context. Weight. Connection. The kind that doesn't appear immediately, but once it does, it rewrites everything around it. At the far end of the table, someone's phone vibrated. Soft. Almost absorbed by the room. But again, timing. Always timing. The person glanced down, read, paused, didn't react. That's what made it visible. Because no reaction is still a reaction. A longer pause now, not coordinated, not intentional, but spreading. Like a delay moving through a system that hasn't yet identified the source. The CEO continued speaking. Numbers, forecasts, controlled language. But something subtle had shifted beneath it. Because now, not everyone was listening to him. Some were listening to something else. Something that hadn't fully surfaced yet. A connection forming just outside the visible layer of conversation. And connections like that don't need volume. They need a single point of confirmation, another vibration, this time closer to the center of the table. A different phone, different screen, same pattern, glance, pause, stillness. The CEO's voice continued, confident, measured, but now slightly ahead of the room, because the room was no longer fully inside the conversation. It was splitting, part of it still following the presentation, another part starting to assemble something else, something incomplete, but forming fast. The director who had glanced earlier now leaned back, not away, upward, like someone creating space to think. And then, quietly, he opened his laptop again, not to the presentation, to email, a few keystrokes, a quick scan. And then, his posture changed. Not dramatically, but definitively. The kind of shift that doesn't ask for attention, but commands it anyway. He didn't speak, didn't interrupt, but his stillness now had direction. And people notice direction, even before they understand it. Across the table, another screen lit up. Then another. No announcement, no signal. Just convergence. Because whatever had started as a question was rapidly becoming a pattern. And patterns, in rooms like this, mean one thing. There's something everyone is about to understand. At the exact same time, the CEO reached the next slide, paused, looked up, and for the first time since she left, he realized the room wasn't where he thought it was. Not disengaged, not distracted, but elsewhere. And that's when it became clear. Her exit hadn't ended anything. It had started something, something already moving, already connecting, already aligning. And whatever it wasn't waiting for permission to surface. Stay with this, because in rooms like this, the most expensive consequences never arrive loudly. The room didn't interrupt him. It withdrew from him, subtly, quietly, almost respectfully. But in high-stakes rooms, withdrawal is louder than conflict, because conflict still acknowledges authority. Withdrawal replaces it. The CEO finished his sentence, or at least he thought he did, because no one responded. No nods, no follow-up questions, no immediate transitions. Just a thin, almost imperceptible delay, like a system waiting for a signal that hadn't arrived yet. Across the table, the first director who checked his email didn't look up right away. He reread it. Once. Twice. Then leaned back. Slowly. The kind of movement that signals recalculation, not confusion. And then he spoke. Who approved the term sheet structure? Not loud, not confrontational, but precise. The CEO's gaze shifted. Finally, something concrete. I did, he said. Immediate, controlled, because that question lived in his domain. Or at least, it used to. The director nodded once. A minimal acknowledgement. Then turned his screen slightly, not fully toward the room. Just enough. I think you should look at this. No urgency, no dramatics. And that's what made it impossible to ignore. The CEO didn't move instantly. He let a second pass, then another, because moving too fast would mean reacting. And reacting implies you're not in control. He stood, walked around the table, measured steps, deliberate pace, every movement still communicating authority. But when he reached the screen, that communication stopped. Not externally, internally, because what he saw didn't match the version of reality he had been operating in. The term sheet was open, clean, structured, standard. Except for one section. Highlighted. Not aggressively, just precisely. Key dependency, strategic alignment with lead advisor. A pause. Then, advisor continuity required for investment execution. Another pause. And then the line that settled into the room like weight. Advisor withdrawal constitutes automatic suspension of investment commitment. Silence. Not reactive. Structural. Because now it wasn't about interpretation. It was about mechanism. The CEO's eyes didn't move quickly. They slowed down. That's how recognition works when it arrives too late. He didn't need to ask who the advisor was. The room already knew. Because suddenly, everything aligned backward. The timing, the calm exit, the absence of resistance. It wasn't compliance, it was completion. Across the table, another phone lit up, then another. Now no one pretended not to notice. The pattern had surfaced, and once patterns surface, they stop being optional. They're reviewing it now, someone said quietly. Not to the CEO, to the room. Because this wasn't his information anymore. It belonged to the structure. The CEO straightened slightly. A reflex. Reassert position. Reframe. She can be replaced, he said. Clear, direct, logical, on the surface. But logic, in systems like this, depends on constraints. And he had just ignored one. The director didn't argue, didn't push back. He simply pointed to the screen. That clause doesn't allow replacement. A beat. It requires continuity. Different word. Different implication. Because replacement assumes interchangeability. Continuity assumes dependency. And dependency changes everything. A subtle shift moved through the room. Not panic. Not yet. But recognition. The kind that recalibrates priorities instantly. Another notification. This time, audible. No one silenced it. Because now, they were waiting for it. The lead investor is on the document, someone added. Quiet, measured. And they've paused the call. There it was. The first external signal. Because internal tension can be contained. External reaction? Never. The CEO's jaw tightened slightly, barely visible, but real. Because the moment had crossed a threshold. From internal decision to external consequence. He looked back at the table, at the screens, at the subtle but undeniable alignment that had formed without him. And for the first time, he wasn't ahead of the room. He was behind it. She chose to leave, he said, not defensive, clarifying, trying to anchor the narrative. But the room didn't follow, because narrative doesn't override mechanism. The director closed the laptop halfway, not dismissing, framing. She didn't leave the system, he said. A pause. She was the system's condition. And just like that, everything settled into place. The exit, the timing, the silence. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't reactive. It was structural. 5 minutes. That's all it took. Not for the situation to change, but for the room to understand what had already changed the moment she stood up. Because some decisions don't trigger consequences later. They reveal consequences that were already built in. And now, those consequences were active. Stay with this. Because the next move won't be about fixing the decision. It will be about surviving it. If this moment felt familiar, if you've ever watched confidence quietly turn into recalculation, follow, like, and stay for the next chapter. Because now it's no longer about the hat. It's about what that moment actually triggered. No one returned to the presentation, not explicitly. No one said, let's pause. But the slide at the front of the room stayed frozen. Numbers still visible, suddenly irrelevant. Because the center of the room had shifted. From projection to consequence. The CEO didn't sit back down immediately. He remained standing beside the director's screen. Close enough to read, too close to ignore. The highlighted clause was still there. Unmoved. Unblinking. As if it had been waiting for this exact moment to be noticed. Pull up the full agreement, he said. Calm. Controlled. But different now. Less directive. More precise. Because precision replaces confidence when certainty disappears. The director didn't respond verbally. He just expanded the document. Sections unfolded. Pages aligned. And suddenly, the room was looking at something none of them had truly seen before. Not the deal. The structure behind the deal. A quiet inhale moved across the table. Because once you see structure, you stop trusting assumptions. Scroll. One word, short, measured. The document moved. More clauses, more cross-references, each one linking back to the same anchor point, strategic advisor continuity. It appeared again, and again, and again. Not emphasized, not highlighted, just embedded, which made it stronger. Because anything repeated that consistently isn't optional, it's foundational. Across the table, someone leaned forward, elbows on the surface now, no longer pretending distance. Who inserted this language? They asked. Careful tone. But the question wasn't neutral. It carried something else. Realization. The CEO didn't answer immediately, because answering required acknowledgement. And acknowledgement changes position. The director zoomed in slightly. Metadata appeared. Timestamp, revision trail, names. And there it was. Not hidden, not buried, just precise. Final revision, 2:14 a.m. editor. Her name, Silence. But this time, it wasn't heavy, it was sharp. Because now the room had something tangible. Not a theory, not an interpretation, a point of origin. She structured it, someone said quietly. Not surprised. Confirming. And in that confirmation, something irreversible happened. The narrative flipped. Because a few minutes ago, she was the variable. Now, she was the architect. The CEO stepped back half a pace. Not retreat, distance. The kind you create when you need a wider view. Because close-range control had already failed. She didn't disclose this dependency, he said. Measured, careful, an attempt to rebalance the frame. But again, the room didn't follow. Because disclosure implies obligation. And obligation depends on what was asked. The CFO, who had remained mostly still until now, finally spoke. She didn't need to. No emphasis. No defense. Just structure. It's in the agreement. A beat. Approved. And that word, approved, landed differently. Because approval isn't passive, it's accountability. The CEO's glad shifted. Not outward. Inward. Reconstructing. Because now the timeline mattered more than the moment. When was it signed? Who reviewed it? What was assumed? And most importantly, what had been missed? Across the room, screens continued to glow. More people scrolling now, verifying, cross-checking. Because once trust in the visible layer breaks, you audit everything underneath it. She knew, someone murmured. Not to accuse. To understand. Because knowing changes intent, and intent changes interpretation. The CFO didn't respond. Didn't confirm. Didn't deny. He simply observed the room recalibrate. Because this wasn't about her anymore. It was about what the system now required. Another notification. This time from the front of the table. The assistant. She looked at the screen. Paused. Then spoke. The lead investor has requested clarification on advisor status. There it was. External pressure, direct, immediate, and impossible to delay. The CEO's posture straightened. Not out of confidence, out of necessity. Because now, the room didn't just need understanding, it needed action. What exactly are they asking? He said, focused, tight. The assistant glanced down again. They're asking if the advisor remains active under the terms of the agreement. Simple question, binary answer, yes or no. And suddenly, everything narrowed. All the complexity, all the structure, all the realization, condensed into a single point of decision. The CEO looked at the document again. At the clause. At the name. At the chain of consequences already forming just beyond the room. And for the first time, he wasn't deciding what to do. He was deciding what to admit. Because the wrong answer now wouldn't just cost control, it would cost the deal. $3.8 billion. Not a number anymore, a threshold. And the room felt it. Stay with this, because the next response won't define the situation. It will define the outcome. No one spoke for a full second. And in that second, the entire room understood the equation. Not the emotional one, the structural one. Answer no, and the deal suspends automatically. Answer yes, and you admit she's still essential. There was no neutral path. That's what made it precise. The CEO didn't look at anyone, not the assistant, not the CFO, not the directors. He looked at the clause, because the clause didn't react, it didn't negotiate, it didn't adjust based on tone or authority, it simply existed. And right now, it was defining the boundaries of reality. Tell them we're reviewing internal alignment, he said. Careful, measured, buying time, not answering. A classic move. But this time wasn't neutral. Time was pressure. The assistant nodded, already typing, message sent. But even as it left, the room knew. This wasn't a delay. It was a countdown. Across the table, someone exhaled slowly. Another leaned back, eyes fixed on the ceiling for half a second, like recalculating from first principles. Because once a system exposes a dependency, you don't fix it with communication. You fix it with alignment. And alignment, right now, had a single missing component. Her. The CEO finally sat down. Not heavily, but deliberately, re-entering the structure. Because standing no longer gave him advantage. It isolated him. "We bring her back," someone said. Not loudly, not formally, but clearly. The first statement in the room that aligned directly with consequence. No one challenged it. Because by now, it wasn't opinion. It was the only viable path. The CEO's fingers tapped once against the table. A reflex, but controlled. Everything about him now was controlled. Because uncontrolled reactions had already proven expensive. She chose to leave, he said. Again. But this time, it didn't land as a position, it landed as a limitation. And limitations, in systems like this, get resolved. Then we remove the condition, another voice added. Logical, on the surface. But the CFO responded immediately. You can't remove a condition that defines execution. Clean, absolute. Because conditions like that aren't decorative, they are the system. And removing them isn't modification, it's collapse. Silence again. But now, focused, directed. The room wasn't scattered anymore. It had converged on a single point. She wasn't optional, she was required. The assistant's phone lit up again, faster this time. Response from the investor. She read it, paused. Then, they've asked again. A beat. For confirmation. The CEO closed his eyes for half a second. Not long, but enough. Because in that half second, he crossed the line from control to reality. He opened them, looked at the CFO, then at the table, then at the empty chair she had left behind. And for the first time, that chair had weight. Call her, he said. No resistance left, no framing, no authority, just instruction aligned with necessity. The assistant hesitated, just slightly. Do we confirm advisor status? There it was. The real question, because calling her wasn't the decision. This was. The CEO didn't answer immediately, because answering meant committing, and commitment now wasn't reversible. He looked at the clause one last time, then said, yes. Quiet, but final. The assistant nodded, typed, sent. And just like that, the room shifted again. Not back, forward, into a version of reality none of them had expected to reach 5 minutes earlier. Where authority didn't lead, dependency did. And now, they were aligned with it. Stay with this, because the final move won't come from the room. It will come from the one person who already left it. The call didn't go through immediately. One ring, then another. No one spoke, because now, every sound in the room had meaning, even silence. The assistant held the phone slightly away from the table, as if distance could soften the weight of what they were waiting for. It couldn't. 3 rings, 4. And then, connection. She didn't say hello, didn't ask who it was. Just a calm, neutral. Yes. The assistant glanced at the CEO. A brief, silent handoff. Then, "We'd like to confirm your status as active strategic advisor under the agreement." Careful wording, structured, clean, because now, every word had legal weight. A pause on the other end. Not hesitation. Assessment. Then, under the original terms, the assistant froze for a fraction of a second, because the question wasn't simple. It wasn't about status. It was about conditions. The CEO leaned forward slightly, not to interrupt, to anchor. "Yes," he said, directly, into the space. And for the first time since she walked out, he wasn't speaking to the room. He was speaking into the system. Another pause. Shorter this time, because she already knew the answer. She was just deciding whether to give it. "You removed me," she said. No emotion, no accusation, just fact. The kind that doesn't need reinforcement. The CEO didn't respond immediately, because response would imply defense, and defense was no longer relevant. "We are restoring your role," he said. Measured, precise. Not an apology, not yet. A correction. On the other end, a faint exhale. Not relief, not tension, just recognition. "Then restore the conditions," she replied. A beat. All of them. And suddenly, the room understood. This wasn't about bringing her back. It was about rebuilding the exact structure they had just broken. And structure, once disrupted, doesn't return partially. The CFO nodded once. Small, but decisive, because he already saw it. Anything less wouldn't satisfy the clause, wouldn't stabilize the investment, wouldn't hold. The CEO's vzglad shifted again, across the table, to the empty chair, then back. "What do you need?" he asked. No authority left in it. Only alignment. Because now, she wasn't responding to him. She was defining the terms of re-entry. Another pause. Then, full continuity. Clear. Access, authority, and non-interference. 3 components. Not negotiable, not flexible, complete. Because partial systems fail. And she didn't build partial systems. The CEO didn't look at anyone this time. He didn't need validation. The room was already there. "Approved," he said. One word. But this time, it carried weight. Because now he understood what approval actually meant. On the other end, silence. Then, "I'll return in 10 minutes. No drama, no leverage, just timing." And the line disconnected. The assistant slowly lowered the phone. No one moved. Because now, the room wasn't waiting for a decision. It was waiting for alignment to complete. 10 minutes, not long, but enough. Enough for everyone to reconstruct the system in their minds, to understand where it actually lived and where it didn't. The CEO leaned back, not defeated, not diminished, recalibrated, because what had just happened wasn't a loss of authority. It was a relocation of it, from position to structure. Across the table, laptops reopened again, but differently this time, not to present, to verify. Access logs, permissions, continuity chains, everything that had been assumed now needed to be confirmed, because assumptions had just proven expensive. Very expensive. $3.8 billion. No longer a projection, a dependency. The door remained closed, but now everyone in the room was aware of it, because when it opened again, it wouldn't be the same moment returning. It would be a different structure entirely. And this time, they would recognize it, not as authority, not as presence, but as something far more precise. Control. The kind that doesn't need to speak loudly, doesn't need to prove itself, and never needs to argue, because it was never in the room to begin with. It was in the system, and the system had just made that undeniable.